It is 11 o'clock, so we are going to get started with our webinar program today. This, of course, is being offered by the International Council of Psychologists, and I'd just like to welcome everyone who's joining us online today. I'm going to open up with just a few words about ICP and about our program, do some introductions, and then get right to our presentation. So everybody knows I'm Andrew Simon. I play several roles at ICP. Most salient today is that I am chair of our newly created webinar program, and we're very excited about the opportunities that we're providing people from around the world. The work that we're presenting is consistent with the mission of ICP, which is to bring together those in psychology and related fields to promote human rights, global health, and issues pertaining to social justice. So we welcome everyone in joining us. A couple of details before we get started today. For those who are calling in, you can join our visual part of our webinar by going to our webpage at icpweb.org, and you can see the webinar announcement on the homepage. And please click on Read More, and then open the link to the presentation. For those who are joining us online, we already have at least 90 people who have logged on. And some of the logistics about the way we'll be structuring it, we'll have our presentation for about 70 minutes. And then the last 20 minutes or so will be used for question and answers and for closing remarks. For those of you who want to ask questions, and we certainly encourage that, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a small chat icon. And when you click on that, it will open up a box on the side of the screen. Please type in your question. In order to manage it, I will be selecting some of the questions and reading them to our presenters, and we will just go from there. Please also note that this broadcast is being recorded and will be posted on the ICP webpage, so you will have a chance to access it in the future if you want to review it again. So without any further delay, I want to introduce our speakers today. My introductions will be brief. They both deserve much more information about them. But please know that we are very fortunate to have with us today both Dr. Michael Stevens and Dr. Patricia Perez. So you know, Dr. Michael Stevens received his formal training in counseling psychology. He's a professor emeritus at Illinois State University and an adjunct faculty member and consultant with the international psychology programs at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. He has over 150 publications, including notable works pertaining to international psychology, very involved in Division 52, the Division of International Psychology from the APA. He's a past president, a recipient of the Outstanding International Psychologist Award, and currently a fellow. Dr. Stevens has been awarded honorary doctorates from universities in both the US and Romania, and today he is also a practicing clinical psychologist and a consultant. And joining him will be Dr. Patricia Perez, also had her formal training in counseling psychology. She's an associate professor in the International Psychology program at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Her research in private practice includes children and families, lifespan development, and global trauma, acculturation, and identity. She has over 25 years of experience working with children and families in community-based settings and in conducting international consulting work. Notably, in 2018, Dr. Perez was an Elizabeth Hurlock Beckman Award winner, which for those of you who don't know is for a professor who has inspired students to engage in their communities and provide service that is at an exceptional level. And she is both a practicing psychotherapist and consultant today. I'd like to welcome both of you, and please feel free to introduce us to this idea of on becoming globally engaged. Dr. Stevens, Dr. Perez, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your kind introduction. And I also would like to thank Mary Bullock, who is behind the scenes, but very integral to our webinar this morning. Christian Sivlak, who graciously invited Dr. Perez and myself to conduct a webinar for the International Council of Psychologists, and of course the leadership of the International Council of Psychologists as well. We're very grateful to be here this morning. Next, please. As you can see from our opening slide or our title slide, there is an interesting upside down map. And this is, as some of you may know, a work entitled Mapa Invertido by Joaquin Torres Garcia, Uruguayan artist. And we chose to sort of include this front and center at the very beginning because it really stands as a metaphor for the overarching goal of what we're trying to do this morning, and that is to think about competency training in psychology from a somewhat different perspective than it's been thought of in the past. In order to become globally engaged, we really need to take a very different perspective, maybe an upside down one, in order to prepare ourselves and our students for entry into the global workforce to do the kind of work that's very much part of the mission of the International Council of Psychologists. Next, please. This is a brief outline of the topics that we hope to accomplish in the time that we have together. As I said in my opening remarks, the webinar is really intended to focus on the competencies, particularly basic competencies, that are needed to work appropriately, effectively, and ethically in the global arena, and very much in keeping with the International Council of Psychologists' mission and goals. We're going to start with a brief definition of international psychology that we've honed over the years at the Chicago School, and it has two components that I think will resonate with many of you. We also want to spend a little bit of time articulating how international psychology is linked to perhaps some of the more familiar psychologies, such as cultural, cross-cultural, indigenous, etc. Then we're going to turn to the competencies themselves, foundational competencies that we feel are basic to becoming an international psychologist. Talk a little bit about what the American Psychological Association and the International Union of Psychological Science has to say about this and what they're actually trying to do to advance international competency in psychology. We're going to look at some competency models, actually two. One is more content-based, one is more process-based, to provide a little bit more detail on what these competencies actually are and actually how to acquire them in the process of lifelong professional development. We are going to share with you a lot of what we have developed over the years at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in their international psychology programs, which are at the master's, doctoral, and certificate levels. The program was established, and Dr. Perez, please correct me, I think in 2009. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And since then, we've really, again, evolved very much in developing a curriculum for the academic and personal development of our students, which I think will provide you with some interesting ideas of how to structure a curriculum, those of you who are academics, that works quite well in preparing students to enter the global arena. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the progress made to date on the internationalizing of the psychology curriculum and recommendations for how we can perhaps overcome some resistance that unfortunately is still there for internationalizing the psychology curriculum. And then we'll have our question and answer, as Andrew mentioned, at the end. Thank you. Next, please. So here is our twofold definition of international psychology, and you can see that we've sort of titled each component of the definition of the field slightly differently. International psychology, which you see at the very top of the slide, I think we can, as you're reading along with this, I think we can think of international psychology as a vision that the entire discipline of psychology aspires to. And that simply is the creation of a contextualized, globally relevant, and responsive psychology, dealing with challenging issues, problems that have a psychological dimension, but clearly are multi-determined, and designing appropriate, responsible actions to address these challenges, to make the world a better place, simply put. The second component of our definition of international psychology really speaks more, I think, to the cross-cultural elements of what international psychology strives to do. It can be viewed in a way, this second component maybe as a corrective process that safeguards psychology against provincialism and obsolescence, because it strives to monitor and promote the contextualization of constructs, processes in all aspects of human and social functioning. So all branches of psychology, including research methodologies, really need to sort of critically examine their relevance and not necessarily make assumptions that they are universally applicable. So this is sort of follows some of what John Barry has talked a lot about, and that is to ensure that if we talk about generalizations in human functioning, that they're actually derived from research rather than imposed by a cultural bias that a scholar may have. Next, please. As I mentioned earlier, international psychology does have some very clear connections with related psychologies. And you can see from the diagram here that it kind of embraces or subsumes in some way or another these four other psychologies within its rubric. Obviously, I know many of you are very familiar with each of these, so let me be very brief in sort of defining them, particularly the ones that may be less familiar, such as international multicultural psychology and intercultural psychology. I've lumped, or Patricia and I, excuse me, have lumped cultural and indigenous psychologies together because there remains some debate as to whether these are actually different or identical. But when we speak about cultural psychology, obviously we're talking about the study of shared goals and values and worldviews that contribute to the regularities that we see in human beings and groups within distinct communities. Culture is both external, but from a psychological point of view, has been internalized within each individual, not necessarily identically, because we're autonomous beings, but certainly to enough of an extent that we can relate to one another. Indigenous psychology is a more abstract, maybe somewhat more detached study of folk representations of the body, mind, self, social issues, etc. And it also has a pragmatic function in that it strives to address developmental and post-colonial collective needs. Now let's talk a little bit about intercultural psychology. In a way, this is well, we know about cross-cultural, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. But let me talk about intercultural psychology because it is sort of an offshoot of cross-cultural psychology. And it really focuses on the specific nature of contact between heritage and host cultures at the personal, group, and even institutional level. So it looks at acculturation processes and outcomes of, for example, immigrants and refugees. But it also has a social justice or social advocacy function in that it develops and promotes policies and programs that support inclusive participation, group well-being, and intergroup harmony, something that we very much need in today's world. And then finally, intercultural multicultural psychology is kind of an internationalized multicultural psychology, if you will. It's the study of the identity development and microcultural development of group members in a country other than the United States. So you can look almost anywhere in the world and find minority cultural groups within a larger dominant or majority culture. And the question is, how do they respond to growing up, developing an identity within that dominant culture, as well as histories of discrimination and injustice that they may also experience. Next, please. So real briefly, again, how does international psychology actually connect with these intersecting psychologies? Well, as I said earlier, international psychology is sort of as a broad umbrella that subsumes cultural, indigenous, cross-cultural, intercultural, and international multicultural psychology. It seeks to understand the many intersecting contexts in which psychological phenomena and, in fact, psychology as a discipline itself are situated. It offers many different ways, often interdisciplinary, for knowing, for researching, and for applied professional practice, and it welcomes diverse perspectives. In fact, you could say that international psychology really is a perspectival orientation to the science and professional practice of psychology. And it tries to avoid cultural reductionism, and I really want to mention a little bit more about this. When we boil everything down to cultural differences, we unfortunately neglect many other diverse and interlaced and perhaps even more relevant contexts that situate human functioning, economic and political systems, geographic location, national historical narratives, even climate has an effect on the way people think, interact, and behave. And so those may be at some point connected to culture, but they're not the same. So international psychology takes a very broad view of what context actually means. And again, it serves, I think, a useful function in not boiling everything down to simply cultural differences. Next, please. Trish.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Stevens, for that background. So we're now going to be discussing what is international psychology competency. As you can see here from this visual, as well as the Anais Nin quote, we can take a minute and just think about what actually happens when we start this journey and when we also arrive to a new destination. It's that process and product, and really understanding that it's quite complex and multifaceted. The other thing that we need to think about when we look at international psychology competency is the notion that it is consistent and aligned with our twofold definition of international psychology. So as Dr. Stevens just pointed out and defined, international psychology and internationalizing psychology. Next, we can think about expanding the definition of competency to broaden it to encompass international psychology competency and also liken it to narrowly more to multicultural competency. So in thinking about all this in a very broad sense, IP competency can embrace a broad spectrum of international context And that situates much of our work as international psychologists and international psychology professionals, and also that we continuously negotiate at many times as international psychologists those competencies and skills. Next slide, please. So here's another visual. So it's all about perspective. I think we talk a lot about this as faculty in our international psychology department and with all of our students. So do we see both? Do we see land? Do we see neither? Do we see anything really? It's all about perspective, or in our training in counseling psychology and in my background as a developmentalist, it all depends. So many of you might be very familiar with these types of intelligences. However, I'd like to go through the evolution chronologically of some of these. So we're looking at 4: social intelligence, emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, and then lastly, relational intelligence. So let's start with social intelligence. So many of you are familiar, could be familiar with Edward Thorndike's work in the 1920s that defined social intelligence as the ability to understand people and really to act wisely in human relations. So social intelligence as defined by Thorndike can also be equated or related to interpersonal intelligence based on Howard Gardner's 1983 theories of multiple intelligences. Moving on to emotional intelligence then, this was Peter Salovey and John Mayer's work in 1989, looking at the capacity to be aware of, to control and express emotions, and also to manage interpersonal relationships in a judicious and empathic manner. Then we look at cultural intelligence, which was Sue Ann and Lynn Van Dyke's work in 2008. Which can also be described as cultural awareness, knowledge, and skills needed to work appropriately and successfully with others across diverse cultural settings, whether it may be domestic or international. And then lastly, which is much more recent, in 2014, Valerie Gauthier's work in relational intelligence, looking really at the ability to be aware and understand your own and others' emotions, values, interests, and demands, and to discriminate among them, to critically reflect on them, and to use this information to guide responses when we interact with other people in context. So in a nutshell, it's really a state of being, a mindset, a capacity, a process, and an act. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr.
Stevens.
Thank you. Some of you may know that the American Psychological Association in 2017 adopted its resolution on promoting global perspectives in U.S. psychology, and it was adopted by the Council of Representatives in February of that particular year. This is obviously, as you can see from the enumeration, somewhat selective drawing from the 13 recommendations in the resolution that cover such things as ethics, theory, research, practice in many different forms, education and training, and professional organizations. I've sort of teased out with Dr. Perez 5 of these that I think are particularly germane to what APA is attempting to do to adopt a more international perspective in all of U.S. psychology. The first one is a statement that promotes inquiry that is inclusive of other perspectives around the world in terms of theory, practice, education, research, and policy. It also encourages all psychologists and psychology students, for that matter, to critically reflect on the meaning and use of particularly Western psychological constructs and processes, and to not necessarily assume, as I mentioned before, that these are either universal or even generalizable. Also important is the notion of partnership and approaching partnership not only in a collaborative manner, but with some humility. And again, these partnerships can take various forms, depending on whether they're science-based, teaching, consultancies, and so forth. But they certainly need to be grounded in an openness and receptivity to perspectives that are non-Western in nature. With regard to psychological education and training at the undergraduate and graduate levels, there's an encouragement for programs to promote opportunities for students to not only experience other cultures, and that can be done almost anywhere, not necessarily by traveling, although Dr. Perez and I and all of you, I'm sure in the audience, highly recommend that as an infusion experience that can be transformative, but even encouraging learning foreign languages, which is really the gateway, in my personal view, to culture. And it's unfortunate that doctoral programs at some point have sort of abandoned that as a requirement for the PhD. But hopefully we'll see some changes in that regard. And then, of course, all psychology, regardless of the particular level that's offered to students, should have a curriculum that not only has set-aside modules, but infuses internationalized psychology into the curriculum. Next, please. We want to take a moment to just share with you some of what the APA and the IUCS have done in terms of their work on developing and promoting international psychology competencies. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific competencies that have emerged from these efforts, but they sort of arise out of the knowledge that psychologists are studying, practicing, and collaborating across national boundaries more than they ever have in the past. And these challenges, or these changes rather, have yielded some benefits that have kind of prompted some thinking about what we should do systematically to inculcate international psychology competencies. So the first benefit, I think, is how we can apply psychological knowledge and methods to diverse populations, not only within our country, the United States, but also around the world. So we recognize that there is a challenge there. And we want to share, of course, with our students and colleagues from around the world, different approaches and strategies for addressing common problems. So the basic task that APA and the IUCS have taken upon themselves is to really kind of examine what does it mean for psychologists and psychology students to develop international psychology competency. And how does that affect their professional identity? And then, of course, the derivative of that particular question is, how do psychology educators facilitate and develop international psychology competencies and a professional identity that is international in their students? Next, please. So as I said before, we want to take a bit of a closer look at what has actually been done in articulating international psychology competencies. And we turn now to the APA's Committee on International Relations in Psychology. A little bit of history on the work of SIRP in terms of their strategic plan to advance APA's involvement in 21st century global psychology and in global issues. In 2013, SERP began its work on developing a strategic plan for basically internationalizing psychology competencies. And you can see that there are some foundational competencies, which is really what we're going to be talking about in the remainder of our webinar today, as well as some psychology-specific competencies. And I should point out that if you haven't already encountered it or read it, I would encourage you to read an article by Morgan Consoli, Inman, Bullock, and Nolan, entitled "The Framework for Competencies for U.S. Psychologists Engaging Internationally," which appeared in 2018 in the Division 52 journal, International Perspectives in Psychology, which kind of summarizes a lot of the work that SERP conducted in its strategic planning. So basic competencies, and we're going to talk much more about this, but let's just quickly sort of take a glimpse at what some of these are that were articulated by the SERP report. Awareness of self and context, and this includes such things as critically self-reflecting on one's assumptions about human functioning, normative values, as well as our own personal biases and limitations. Linguistic communication practices. How are worldviews acquired? How are they expressed? And how do we sort of negotiate different worldviews when we are engaged internationally? And of course, familiarity with the influence of global and local systems, so that when we are working in various international contexts, we embrace the knowledge of that particular context's history and the current status, perhaps economic, perhaps political, perhaps social, in order to negotiate a successful and respectful entry into a community, into a culture, into a country. So those are some very, very broad, basic, foundational competencies. And again, these weren't just sort of plucked out of the air, but this is sort of the distillation of work that was done, information that was gathered from educators, practitioners, scholars, and consultants at various psychology conferences, when they were asked basically what's needed minimally to be internationally competent. And then at the bottom of this slide, you can see that there are some very, very specific psychology competencies, knowing what the shared and distinctive disciplinary boundaries are between psychology and, for example, sociology, anthropology, political science. What are some of the systems, theories, methodologies, practices, ethics, and laws that psychologies that are situated in other countries have adopted, and how do we need to accommodate our involvement internationally within the realities of the psychology as they are constituted elsewhere. Next, please. Dr. Perez.
All right, so let's take a look at one of the two models and frameworks that Dr. Stevens had mentioned, one on content, which is this one, the pyramid model of basic international psychology competencies, and then later Dr. Stevens will present the other model focused on process. So this model is content-oriented, and it also holds cognitive, affective, behavioral, and interpersonal meaning. This is also drawn from the work of Deardoff in 2009, the Handbook of Intercultural Competence. So the pyramid of basic IP competency, if you could take a look at these levels, the pink level requisite attitudes, and then the one above, the orange level, knowledge and comprehension and skills, are what we could consider developing capacity building. Then if you move forward, move up to the red, desired internal outcomes, we can see that as internal transformation. And then lastly, the yellow, external application or desired external outcome. Next slide, please. So when we actually take a look then much more closely at the basic international psychology competencies and those internal and external outcomes, let's take a moment here to go through some of these. But before we do that, just give some macro level thoughts on all of these. So first, when we think about these basic international psychology competencies, we need to understand that these domains overlap. They're also equally important. They're necessary but not sufficient. And they're also sequential and recursive. The way that it's presented here in this slide is in a general form to really emphasize their transferability and their utility. And they are not linked to what was discussed in the earlier slide to psychology-specific international psychology competencies. So I'm going to highlight a couple pieces of information for each one of these, and then we'll be moving forward. So when we look at attitudes, the hope here as an international psychologist or an international psychology professional is to be able to have some of these pieces to that personal and professional self, the curiosity, intentionality, openness, and respect, and really looking at cultures and countries. Additional attitudes include things like tolerating ambiguity, persistence, withholding judgment, valuing other contexts. And again, this is all as that lifelong learner. When we're looking at knowledge, this is really geared to understanding context, your context, others' context, and the awareness that we view the world in a very particular way based on our history and our background. Also time as well. And for example, things like, subtleties in the culture and our language. So this is the ability to be self-aware in context, what we consider normative in our understanding, inclusion and knowledge and mastery of the foundational and topical international psychology literature, and many opportunities in our work for interdisciplinary learning. Then moving on to skills is really managing both the attitudes and the knowledge that were just presented. So we don't necessarily need to like another context or accept it. However, we do need to monitor our reactions to those values and customs, especially if they're different from our own. So how do we do this? We can observe. We make sense of things by analyzing, interpreting, and integrating. We're monitoring constantly in the context, activities, and whatever's asked of us. That's self-regulation. And through our interactions, we build relationships, from initial to sustaining relationships. Then as an outcome, we have those internal outcomes and external outcomes. So let's start with the internal outcomes. So when we look at that, we're looking at taking a cultural perspective as well as self-reflecting and soliciting feedback. So let's start with a contextual perspective. So really trying to view things as other people do, grounded in their context, whether it's a country, the situation, event, or a culture. And by doing so, by adapting and adopting their perspective, we might be able to understand just a little bit what's happening around us. The next piece for internal outcomes is that self-reflection. We reflect constantly and learn from interactions and experiences as they occur in the present. For example, we might ask a local individual or someone we've just built a relationship with in another country what they think about our behavior. And then lastly, the external outcomes. So this is when we have that opportunity to interact cross-culturally and cross-contextually. So we anticipate what we say, how we want to perceive it in that way. We use what we know initially through the culture and the country to strategize the best way to engage interpersonally and across people. So how do we do this? We try to strive to be appropriate. We try to strive to be effective and really understand and manage those ethical dilemmas and those through international encounters. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Perez. Dr. Perez just shared with you sort of a content-based model of foundational international psychology competencies. And so now we're turning to more of a process model for developing an international psychology identity. And again, both of these are very clearly tied to the work that the APA and the IUCIS and the Committee for International Relations and Psychology have undertaken and continue to refine. Before beginning, let me just say that this is kind of a homegrown model from the International Psychology Department at the Chicago School, and I would like to give credit to its innovative authors, Dr. Brita McGrath, who is the Dean of the online campus, and 4 of our doctoral graduates, Dr. Stephen D. Donato, Laura Erickson, Joyce Yip Green, Felice Mays, and Amber Rexilius. It has been presented in 2018 and will again be presented at this summer's APA convention in Chicago. So just by way of introduction to this process model, and by the way, it's sort of in development. It continues to evolve and be refined with input, as well as at some point going to be tested. But as I said, it is a process-oriented model, and it kind of has some underlying assumptions, one of which is that to become competent as an international psychologist requires action. You can't just read about it. You have to actually get your feet wet, get immersed as much as possible. It's also developmental, as Dr. Perez had said before, and as she also pointed out, a lifelong process of professional development. The components of this model, like the more content and outcome-oriented model that Dr. Perez spoke about, they are reciprocal, they are recursive. The vortex that sort of is a visual in this was chosen deliberately as a metaphor for the dynamic and again iterative process of developing IP competencies, how we are essentially transformed into something different from what we were. And I'll share a little bit about my own experiences in the same vein as is captured by this model. And then lastly, it's a wonderful way of sort of thinking about education and training of a future generation of international psychologists. So what I'd like to do is sort of start from the bottom of the vortex and then kind of work upwards towards the very top. So we'll begin with pre-international psychology identity. Now, the idea here is that we all come to psychology with some history, family history perhaps, personal history, our own cultural, ethnic, national identity, our personal life and work experiences, which sort of give us sort of a context. We're not blank slates. We all have not only our individual identities and the way in which we connect to people all over the world, but also our group identities based upon our development. And we part of this pre-IP identity stage includes a sense that many have that there's something missing, perhaps even a frustration, but certainly a desire to fill this void. And what is that void? That there's something bigger than the reductionistic, mechanistic, quantitative paradigm that we all learned in graduate school. There's something more to our understanding of human functioning and experience. And I certainly can tell you from my own experience that about midway through my academic career, I really felt stale and frankly quite bored. And I just happened to stumble upon at a convention, an APA convention, a newly launched division called International Psychology, and I stepped through the door and I was revitalized, because what were the founders of this division talking about? They were talking about context, political systems, economic systems, religion, social structure, interdisciplinary understandings of human behavior. And it filled that frustration, as well as provided an outlet for the desire to incorporate more of these relevant areas into my understanding of theory, research, and practice. So moving to cultural exchange, the next step in this upward movement towards transformation, what we mean here is some sort of interactional element in which we are exposed but are forced in some way to negotiate contexts that are unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable for us. So when we go to another country and we don't know what some of the informal norms are for how we relate to one another, this certainly can be an opportunity to sort of really reflect and learn and grow as we try to negotiate new norms and the values that underlie them. But it also can occur through international collaboration as well, in which we have different ways of understanding what ethics are, what order of authorship is, how research is conducted, what is the best way to teach and train psychologists. And so here too, we have professional norms that challenge some of our biases that we haven't really reflected very much about. Moving on to cultural competency, here we're really talking about the growth in our self-awareness, particularly of our implicit bias, and our ability to really, and I really underscore the word cultural empathy, but also I would add to that cultural humility as we try to really understand and engage appropriately, respectfully, in contexts that differ from our own, both personally as well as professionally as well. This is where some of that transformative effect begins to be seen as we develop some of these basic capacities that Dr. Perez spoke about. We have to not only self-reflect, but we have to decenter and draw upon an expanded new schemas to shift our perspectives and to adapt our behaviors. And then finally, we have praxis, in which we now are at least minimally capable or minimally skilled at applying our basic competencies to personal and work settings. But as you can see, this all repeats as we continue the process throughout our professional and personal lives. Dr. Perez, next, please.
All right, so we're pleased to actually present as an example the actual International Psychology Department's curricula at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. So as Dr. Stevens mentioned, the PhD program started in 2019, then followed several years ago the master's program in international psychology, and then the newly launched certificate program that was launched fall of 2018. We're also going to be taking a look at how all of those programs and courses and training are related to our program learning outcomes that also align with the Chicago Schools institutional outcomes. We're going to give you also a snapshot of our training approach that encompasses the twofold definition of international psychology, the models and frameworks, and thoughts on the intelligences and what those competencies are. And then lastly, taking a look at some of the ways that we evaluate and assess across our 3 programs. Next slide, please. So if we look at the IP programs here, we have 3, the PhD, the master's, and the certificate programs. So as you can see here, for the PhD program, we have 2 main concentrations, the trauma services and organizations and systems. For the master's, we have trauma and group conflict and management and leadership. And then for the certificate program, which is post-bachelor's, we're looking at man-made and natural disasters, focusing on crises-informed care in our diverse globalized world. Unlike the other 2 programs, the PhD program has on-site, on-ground campus in our Washington, D.C. campus and online. The other 2 programs, the master's program and the certificate, are both online. Again, across all of these programs, they're non-clinical and non-licensure, really drawing from standards across countries of how to align that. You can also see there the credit hours and the academic piece that's required in order to receive these degrees and the certificate. However, with the PhD and the master's programs, there is 2 Chicago residencies where our doctoral students come twice in this program to learn, to meet with their faculty, learn more about the program and the field of international psychology, to hear from keynote speakers and alumni. They have 2 field experiences. This is likened to, some people would say, a study abroad. However, we like to call it a field experience because it really is almost like an apprenticeship Vygotsian model where you follow the field experience lead as that expert and what it may look like in research, practice, and consultation as an international psychologist. So the master's students only have 1 field experience. And then continuing with the PhD, we have, just like other psychology doctoral programs, we have the written comprehensive exams, the oral comprehensive exams, that is our proposal defense for the chapters 1 through 3, and an international psychology dissertation, which we draw on the foundational literature in international psychology. We also, unless it is an acculturation psychology or intercultural psychology study, really conducted, their data is conducted collection is conducted outside of their home country. Next slide, please. So if you take a look here, this is our general approach. I'm sure there's more missing pieces, but here's a big picture of things that are some pieces to our training that are interrelated. 5 pieces. So if we could take a look at the synchronous, asynchronous learning piece, especially on the online, as part of the online campus, it's 8 weeks. It's all year round. We have 7 weeks. So for example, we have, for the field experience, for that course, we have 7 weeks in the online program on Canvas, and then that last week, they go actually to the country to really go through the IP identity model and to build those attitudes, knowledge, and skills. We also have built-in mentorship. So once a student comes to any of our 3 programs, they are assigned a faculty advisor. There's also informal routes. We have an IP or International Psychology Ambassadors Club. We have an alumni network, and then also through their dissertation chair that could also provide mentorship. We also have opportunities for interprofessional education, which is defined as 2 or more professions that learn about, from, and with each other to enable effective collaboration and to improve health or other professional outcomes towards that interprofessional practice. So we have that, and we actually have several courses that are aligned with it. Moving on to foundational literature, this we have obviously Dr. Stevens' work in international psychology and also works from non-Western authors that provide information from those intersecting psychologies that Dr. Stevens spoke about. And then lastly, we have several courses, especially the field experience course, that allows us to transform ourselves, feel uncomfortable, or at least be comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, and also immerse ourselves in that. So the DC campus, they have a different format, but at this moment, I'm just really speaking to some of the pieces on the online, although there are similarities and differences across campuses. Next slide, please. So when we take a look at these program learning outcomes, we have 5 across all of our courses: critical psychology, diversity, critical self-reflection, ethics, social justice, and research. All of these align with our Chicago school across all campuses, our institutional outcomes. So I'm not going to read all of these, but just give you a little bit of a highlight of each one of these. So when we look at critical psychology, this one is aligned with the institutional outcome of professional practice, really looking at those historical and philosophical underpinnings and those traditions that is not only rooted in the US and Europe, but also beyond. When we look at diversity, we do have an institutional outcome of diversity, looking at similarities and differences when we think about all of those psychological services that may or may not be the same depending on that context across various populations. When we look at critical self-reflection and ethics and social justice, that is aligned with our professional behavior institutional outcome. Really, the critical self-reflection really is ongoing across all of our courses, but we're really just like sort of the funnel model with the IP identity model. We're discovering, recognizing, and describing and managing that behavior with individuals, groups, and systems. Ethics, we're looking at the Universal Declaration of Ethical Principles and also APA with those ethical principles and code of conduct, knowing that in our work, as we transform, there might be ethical dilemmas that we will need to address. And then lastly, our institutional outcome of scholarship then in our program is fulfilled through research. So we have courses in qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, really to address that psychological global phenomenon, and also embodied and also the critical review of the research literature relevant to IP. Next slide, please. All right, here is some just opportunities based on our program learning outcomes, based on our our academic training. So for example, in critical psychology, we have those written comprehensive exams. Actually, it was quite similar in my counseling program. However, the focus here, as we've all been talking, is international psychology. Diversity, we actually have courses that are gradated. We have an intro to cultural perspectives, which addresses diversity literature and application. Then we move forward to looking at acculturation across context. Critical self-reflection, as I mentioned, of course, this is all within all of our courses, but the field experience really provides that service learning, interprofessional education, and that cultural immersion to move us forward in that content model, and also to move us forward for that practice, although we're moving continuously all around as well for that. Within the residency, our on-ground residency in Chicago, we address ethics and social justice through looking at ethical dilemmas and talking about it in groups, in addition to dissertation work. And as I mentioned before, research, we have that international psychology dissertation as a culmination of the scholarship in our field. Next slide, please. All right, so just really just a very quick snapshot here of our formative and summative assessments. In a formative online and on ground, We have discussion postings, individual and group, so students learn how to reflect and learn and understand their own individual contributions, as well as how they work in a team through group projects. We have quizzes for that didactic learning. We have case vignettes for application. We also challenge them to present on ground and online. The summative was also, we also have in Canvas, and we have a signature assignment, and within all of our assignments and our courses, we have an assessment rubric that tackles 4 demonstration levels that go from novice, internship, entry level, and then finally graduate. Dr. Stevens?
Thank you, Dr. Perez.
Next slide, please.
So what do we do from here? We've tried to kind of trace the origins and show some of the ways in which we can think about the development of international psychology competencies, and of course how to actually approach the education and training of future psychologists who are prepared to work internationally. I think if we had to sort of summarize, Dr. Perez and I would say, as well as many of you who are international psychologists, that basic foundational competencies are needed for psychologists to engage ethically and effectively with individuals, groups, organizations, and communities that are diverse, whether they're here in the United States, but also in various corners of the world. Regardless of setting and the nature of the work, it's now, I think, rather clear that that we have to pursue this and sort of work towards furthering the international preparation of our students. So how do we actually go forward? And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, because it often involves upsetting the apple cart or turning the map that you saw at the very beginning of the webinar upside down. Next slide, please. One of the things that we can do is to try to actually get some data to evaluate the degree to which the psychology curriculum has been internationalized. And the slide that you currently see is a somewhat dated summary of survey work done by Dr. Richard Vallejo and Dr. Gloria Grenwald, who were co-chairs of the Division 52 Curriculum and Training Committee. And in 2010, they had put together an online survey of psychology educators and asked them to basically respond to some of these questions with regard to content of courses, methodology, pedagogy, student assignments, internet-based technology, and other. And you can see that there's a very high percentage of responses that indicated that the content of psychology courses at various levels and various different specialties had in fact been internationalized to some degree. Much less progress had been made in 2010 on some of these other dimensions of internationalizing the curriculum. Now, admittedly, this is somewhat dated, but the question really is this enough? Is it enough for us to be thinking about internationalizing the curriculum, or do we have to go somewhat beyond that and sort of train our students, our future students, as well as ourselves in basic international psychology competencies that are much more personal? Critical self-reflection has been talked about a lot this morning. Cultural humility, respectful interaction. These are not necessarily things that you get in course content. So the question I think we have to ask ourselves, acknowledging that this data is somewhat old, is this enough? And more recent research done by Lynette Bikos and her colleagues and students have shown that, in fact, efforts to internationalize the psychology curriculum are far from being fulfilled at this point. And her study and other presentations that she's given on this have really involved sort of mixed method research in which faculty as well as students have been surveyed. Next slide, please. So we have to ask ourselves, with all the arguments that we've presented in favor of developing foundational competencies as well as psychology-specific ones for international work, why hasn't more happened at this particular point in time, given all the efforts from APA, IUCIS, resolutions, revised guidelines? We're still stuck, or at least plodding along, which, if that's the case, I'm a little bit more happy about. But we have to really think a little bit about some of the barriers, maybe some of the sources of resistance. And so one of the ways that we can think about barriers to promoting international psychology competency is sort of this decision tree. And I would encourage each of you, as you're looking at this, to ask yourself on which side do you fall, the red side or the green side? Are you sort of uncomfortable and sort of feel as though this isn't something that is worth doing or that you would be willing to invest? Or do you feel like this is something worth doing and that you're prepared to invest in your own way, given your professional work and setting, to promote international psychology competencies? So we can sort of go through this, this decision tree. Hopefully, many of us have, through our own reading and through the webinar, have come to see that internationalizing psychology competencies are important, that we're not in as good a place as we could be, that there is more to do, and that we are ready to make our own personal and professional commitment to doing that to the extent that we're actually able to. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at some possible ways of overcoming resistance at different levels. So for those who perhaps feel that it's not important to promote basic international psychology competencies, one sample response to that might be, or challenging response might be, well, try to identify the benefits, both personally and professionally, to global engagement based upon these foundational international psychology competencies. What does it offer that currently not as available? If you believe that it's good enough, what we've accomplished to date is good enough, and we are comfortable with that, what's the evidence that we have that either supports or doesn't support the basic competencies that our students, as well as our colleagues and ourselves, might have to engage effectively and appropriately in the global arena? What evidence do we have to support the good enough position? For those who might feel we can't do more, I think we have to really understand that academics and psychology educators are already quite burdened with a lot of day in, day out responsibilities, and there need to be some institutional opportunities provided by universities and even psychology organizations, perhaps to help psychology educators design courses that strengthen these competencies that we've talked about this morning. Perhaps by attending workshops, webinars, international conferences that provide the opportunity to do more rather than the position that not more can be done. And then for those who recognize that more can be done but reject taking on some of those challenges and tasks, again, I think institutional support, both financial and professional, would be very, very helpful. What are the criteria for getting release time, raises, promotion, and tenure? What is the incentive structure within departments, colleges, and universities as a whole to support advancing basic international competencies within psychology? So I think there are some personal as well as structural elements to this process, but we really do need to kind of think about where the process gets hung up or slowed down. Next slide, please. And so at this point, Dr. Perez and I would like to just share with you some of the resources, basically the book covers that we found particularly helpful in developing our own understanding of what internationalizing psychology competencies is all about and how to go about that process. And so we, at this point, I think, would like to open up the webinar for your input.
So thank you very much. You should both know that we have a few people engaged on chat, but I was getting some comments sent to me in addition, and people really appreciate not just the information you provided, but the specifics you gave around competencies and issues related to what can actually be done. I have a few questions that I would like to pass along. So one of them, and this comes from someone who's very experienced in the field and wanted to engage in a discussion about the word international with the emphasis on nation, which implies nation states and geographic boundaries, in contrast to the given definition of international psychology. And she's asking, are the words international and internationalizing perhaps outdated in the globalized context?
Dr. Perez, you want to take a stab at that and I'll chime in?
Okay. All right. That's an excellent question. I think that, I think our students ask the same question as far as the terminology. I'll just start with international versus global or worldwide, all of those three. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. I would also think that just from, I guess, the strictest sense, and of course, Dr. Stevens can definitely add his thoughts on this, that international, thinking about that and whether also it's outdated, is between nations, while global is much more broad in thinking about that. Again, there's similarities and differences with that terminology. I mean, I also think from just a context perspective, that just like when we talk about trauma, okay, so when I give just a little example, when we talk about trauma, and many of our students think trauma is universal, when we actually investigate other cultural context, and that word actually, for example, in Ghana for mental health, sometimes the way that, at least in my interactions there with program hosts, they don't define trauma as we may define trauma. So it is a very great question to think about how, whether it's outdated, whether it's relevant, whether it actually meets our needs as professionals. I think there's a lot of ways we can think about. These are the type of things that I actually talked to Dr. Stevens a lot about, it just like the positioning of these words. All right, I could go on. Dr. Stevens, go ahead if you have some thoughts there.
I really appreciate your thoughts, Dr. Perez, as well as the question. I think it's a very provocative one in the best sense of that word. In some sense, I think we could substitute, as Dr. Perez said, global psychology for international psychology, globalizing psychology for internationalizing psychology, in a very pragmatic sense, because we have a division of international psychology, because we have a program titled international psychology. We tried, I guess, for some degree of consistency, at the same time recognizing the limitations of the term. The other concern I think about using maybe another word like global is that we don't want to make assumptions that what we are promoting is necessarily applicable to everyone everywhere in the various things that psychologists do around the world. So we're a little bit cautious about using that particular word to sort of avoid making assumptions that really are not fair to make. So I think, to be quite honest with you, I think this is something that it remains open, and I think the label will evolve as we engage in this kind of dialogue.
Great, thank you. And more questions are coming in, so I will just offer them to you as they're showing up. Here's one from an attendee who asks, what are the career outcomes for a PhD besides becoming a professor? This person was a student within this program, but changed to medical school because it was difficult to determine a solid and lucrative future within this type of program. Would you provide insight on how somebody could return or get into the profession without having to follow a professor track?
Hey, Dr. Stevens, I think I could talk about that or respond to that yes. All right, there's many. I think there are many avenues for careers in international psychology that is not just being a professor or faculty. Many of our students actually already come in, whether they're bachelor's level, master's level, or doctoral level, they all come in with areas of specialty. And many of them want to either internationalize that skill set. And so what they do then is that they come into our program on those various levels to be able to then identify those competencies and that framework of international psychology. So here are some of the things our students have done. Obviously, this is not a totally exhaustive list, but they've either started their own non-governmental organization that they felt very passionate about. They actually, some of them have worked in policing or governments, and they actually created a track that actually utilizes a core concept or the competencies of building out and broadening based on foundational competencies. We also have students who are already quote unquote international in their application. However, maybe they come in wanting to learn more about the structure, like organizational and systems, and then they also take courses in trauma. So, I mean, there are really many of them. I think that also for our students, we recommend that they join Division 52, they join international organizations. I also urge my students at least to have informational interviews of someone or one of us who's a mentor, where to talk to us about how we became or our journey. So we could look at that pre-identity model again. So those are all the different ways. I'm sure there's more ways. Dr. Stevens, you have other thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Perez. I don't think there's sort of a set position for international psychologists to seek employment in, although certainly you could argue that academic work is the most logical for that. But there are other things, as Dr. Perez said. For example, to piggyback off of some of the possibilities she mentioned, consulting. either with government or non-government agencies, businesses, and industries. Advocacy work would be another very important role that could be taken. Policy making, program design and evaluation, training the trainer models, for example, in the area of trauma services. So it's there are a lot of competencies that are very, very specific in what I've mentioned that could be transferable to a lot of different kinds of careers, perhaps even ones in which someone is already in, but now could add to their toolbox and do international work with much greater effectiveness than they were able to before.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. This person is noting that a lot of the discussion is about cultures outside of the United States. And with respect to the phrase intercultural, have there been much work done looking at the diversity of cultures within the United States?
Most definitely. I mean, one of the things, I think at this point we would all agree that multicultural psychology is the fourth force of psychology. It's well established. And increasingly, we are now looking at cultures of recent immigrants and refugees that are entering the country, and the unique acculturative challenges that they experience as they encounter host cultures or host communities that are either receptive or not receptive, and how we can create inclusive opportunities for full participation in our country as a whole, but also respect the maintenance of heritage culture as well. So I do think intercultural psychology has gained a firm footing. It's something that John Barry has been pioneering in his work in Canada. And I think increasingly we're seeing now the internationalization of multicultural psychology here in the States. You might, whoever asked the question, maybe some others might be very interested in reading the latest iteration of the APA's multicultural guidelines, which now takes a very, very strong international focus, encouraging psychologists here in the United States to really recognize the culture not only of minority citizens, but also recent immigrants and refugees in the research and service that they provide as professionals.
Dr. Perez, do you want to comment too, or should we move on to the next one?
I'll make a sort of a developmental comment. I actually, when I started my work, my doctoral program in counseling psychology with a minor in multicultural counseling, it was during that time in the 90s where I had not even heard of international psychology. So as a student, I was very much, as an immigrant to the United States from the Philippines, thinking about multiculturalism. So the focus was U.S. multiculturalism in that training. Many of the core concepts of like diversity and things like that can cross over, very similar to what we talked about in the intersecting psychologies. However, what's fabulous about gaining the skill sets or understanding from an international psychology perspective is really understanding that root culture. So really going back and really understanding that root culture through acculturation, through whatever the status is in international migration. And so this is where we could see the pairing of both of them. But yeah, it's really not like which one's better than the other. It's really, at least for my story, an involvement. And I'm very for getting a breadth of knowledge as opposed to a narrowing.
That really leads into another question that's been posed, which is that having both been formally trained in the U.S., beginning your careers, what have you found to be the most challenging aspects of your work in contexts outside the U.S.?
Oh my goodness. Well,
lots of challenges.
go ahead, Dr. Stevens. You can start with this one. This one's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, well, there've been a lot of challenges, and basically they've been sort of at the interpersonal level, because it's almost inevitable that working outside of the United States involves sort of negotiating the interpersonal dimension of collaboration. You can't just parachute into another country or culture and do what you do alone. So I think it's just understanding not only professional norms and customs, but also personal ones as well. In my particular case, it's it's something really simple. I remember doing wanting to do a collaborative project with a colleague in Romania, and being a typical American, I was as soon as I came to his home, I was ready to talk business. So let's get started. What are we going to do? And so forth and so on. And he completely ignored me. And so I kind of went along with all the protocol, and then asked again, and he completely ignored me again. And then after hours of drinking, smoking, and eating a multi-course meal that was beautifully prepared, he turned to me and said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "Yes, we'll do the project." And so, I felt very, very foolish, but I came to understand that there is such a thing as normative protocol for the kind of professional collaboration that's essential. And to the extent that you can prepare in advance, that's great, but oftentimes you can't. And sometimes it's helpful to have a cultural guide, someone either on site or maybe before you leave here in the States, that can really give you some insights as to how to approach the kind of partnership that promises to bear fruit.
Dr. Perez, would you like to address that too?
Yes, please. So I grew up moving every 4 to 5 years from the Philippines to different parts of the United States and London, England. So actually airports and moving and luggage are, for me, in my context, feel like another home. So I feel very comfortable in that. However, in a professional capacity, it's really that fine-tuning and reminding myself that if this isn't this can be personal. However, there is a professional capacity based on the training. Actually, I'm one of those type of people, and maybe Dr. Stevens can say yes or no, but I sort of buck and challenge myself. I like to challenge what the norms are because I like to question it. And I think the field of psychology is great at that. With international psychology, when I go to other countries or work with people from other contexts, I always have to remind myself of several things that I'm going to, and we tell our students the same thing, that you're going to feel uncomfortable. I mean, just like even long flights, you may be sitting next to, in your seat. You may not know the language. How do you navigate all of this? For me too, being a woman in some parts of the world, sometimes it's not considered, in a point of leadership, that may not be recognized like if I was here in the United States potentially, or in that context. I also have to think about, what am I vetting? How are people perceiving me? And if I have a question, I typically have a cultural guide in country, and I have that building that rapport, and I say, okay, what did you think about this? And having that humility that I can get that constructive feedback, because we all make mistakes. And I think that is a crucial part of all of this, that whether we were trained in the United States, whether we were trained in other places, that from a contextual standpoint, we could continue learning. But we also need like a baseline to come into a country or a situation with some sort of knowledge.
Thank you for this. I am sorry to say that we are purely out of time. We have more questions that people have posed.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of just positive feedback with respect to the value of your entire presentation. I just want to take the last minute or two to thank everyone for logging on and joining us. On behalf of ICP, we thank you. I want to thank Mary Bullock and the webinar committee who also helped to make this possible. We encourage people to join future webinars and even to join ICP and take part in our work. Most of all, I want to thank Dr. Stevens and Dr. Perez. This has been very informative, completely consistent with the work we are doing, and we are very grateful for both your expertise and your time. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.